First, I just want to thank you guys so much for investing so much in marriages and the lives of LCC. And so I know that you have a heart for that. You really do have a passion for that. So tell me kind of what fuels that passion for marriages.
So, I don't say this at all in an arrogant way, but in a very blessed way. Mary and I have a healthy marriage and have for many years. Not perfect. We don't try to ever pretend to be. We have struggles and we work through issues consistently in our marriage. But overall, it is just a very healthy marriage that has brought so much joy to my life. And I want everyone else to experience that. So that's where the heart of it, I think both of us, is when I come into contact with someone that doesn't have a marriage like ours, I want them to, because I know what a blessing it is. It is the foundation next to salvation. It is the foundation that allows me to lead and to connect and really have optimism for the future. And so I want all my friends to experience that. I want the church to. And when I went on sabbatical a few years ago, I didn't feel unhealthy going into that, but just taking a break for 6 weeks. We just traveled, me and Mary and our kids. It was the best season of my life. But while I was doing that, I realized that God was doing some cool things in my heart. And I came back and we sat down, because that was your job. And I sat down and I said, I really want to focus on wholeness now. Wholeness physically, wholeness financially, wholeness relationally, and specifically Mary and I have a passion for marriages. And so that launched a couple of years ago, where we just started really having a passion for marriages and helping them. But it all comes out of that, just that drive. I want everyone to experience what God's blessed me with.
Mm-hmm. In marriage, for those of you who are married, you know marriage is hard. Marriage is work. It's a blessing, like Matthew was saying, but it takes being purposed, and it takes, just like anything else in your life, if you want to be healthy physically, you have to be purposed to do the steps in order to get there. And I think sometimes we look at marriage and we think, oh, it'll just happen, that we'll have this great marriage and things will work out really well. We'll just know how to communicate with one another. And that's not the case. It takes all the steps to get there in order to have a healthy marriage. And so that's part of my passion, is I want people to know that be encouraged that if you don't have a marriage that is healthy, you can get there, but it's going to take work and it's going to take being purposed in order to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because dating's so easy, or easier, so we dated for a long time, had really healthy, you just assume like marriage is just going to be the best dating life ever, because now you get to live together. Now, it's just going to be so much more fun. And when you don't experience that right away, you step into marriage and you're like, wait a second, what's this? This
Everything
is hard.
is exposed
Yeah.
that you do wrong, and vice versa.
Yeah, and like when you're dating, it's like, if you're kind of annoyed, it's like, see you tomorrow, babe. It's not a big deal. In marriage, it's like, oh wait, we're together. Like, and honestly, they use a bad term, but we're stuck. To that, I've never thought that. And so, yeah.
What would you say is kind of the foundational elements of every marriage?
Yeah, so let me talk about what I think the goal is, and then Mary can address it from her perspective. The goal of marriage, in our culture, I would say, if you were to ask the average person and say, what's the goal of marriage, they would go, a happy marriage. I want to have a happy marriage. I would say that's actually wrong, because, and I want to explain why, is I think if your goal of marriage is happiness, it naturally lends itself toward being selfish. And so you think about yourself, you want your own wants and desires. In Scripture, Jesus describes marriage as the best example of our relationship with God. And really, it's the best way to learn how God relates to us and what He's called us to, because marriage is difficult and requires you to die to yourself. So the goal of marriage and the foundation of marriage has to be a pursuit of knowing Jesus and honoring Jesus. So in Ephesians, he tells wives to submit to their husbands. Actually, in the context of it, he says, everyone submit to each other. So that's Ephesians 5:21, I think, or maybe it's 20. But he says, submit one to another. And then in the next verse, he says, wives to your husbands. So the word submit's not even in that. It's actually implied from the verse before that. So he goes, everybody submit. Wives to your husbands. And the way you submit is just as you do to Christ. So how does Christ call us to submit? He calls us to die. So then he goes on and says, and husbands, I want you to lead your wives, but this is how you lead them, the same way that Christ has led the church through dying and giving himself up for her. So he says, women, I want you to die to yourselves. Men, I want you to die to yourselves. It's this beautiful image, but that is a great description of marriage. It doesn't sound romantic. You don't see that on too many cards, like, I'm so happy I get to die, when I marry you. But that is, the truth is, it's a process of dying to yourself. When the goal becomes honoring Jesus and dying to yourself, then marriages have a potential to really be healthy. And then the byproduct of that is happiness. And so if we don't begin with that context, even today, if we don't begin with the context that you're called to die to yourself, then everything else we share later on is going to sound like horrible advice. Because if you go to like a secular counselor and talk about marriage and they have no biblical perspective, they're going to tell you things how you can defend yourself, how you can protect yourself. And again, if you have no relationship with God, you should do that. But if you have a relationship with God, you're understanding that you're called to die to yourself. And so once you have that context, is all the advice we're about to give you is based on that. You have to die to yourself first. And so that's the foundation.
And I don't have anything to add,
Okay.
because I think I said that every week in class, is it's just dying to yourself. And it seems like for all of you single people, you're going, marriage sounds awful right now. But it's a blessing, because you get to experience what God has for you when you do die to yourself and serve your spouse.
All right, along with that, what would you say are just some healthy habits or tools that you can kind of need, or that you can put input into your life and marriage?
Why don't you go first, and then I'll add on.
Okay, some of the things that I think are most important are the willingness to forgive your spouse, because in all human relationships, as you make mistakes, and especially in a marriage, our mistakes are exposed very clearly to our spouse. We have to be willing to forgive them, and it sounds so easy to do as I'm saying that, but we know that's a very difficult process. But it's the constant rhythm of forgiving a spouse and being willing to give them another chance and work at it. And I also think one of the things we talk about a lot is putting your spouse as a priority in our busy lives. For all of us, I'm sure, we get so busy with work, with our kids, with everything that we have going on, our schedules. And I think it's so important to put your spouse as a priority and make that be purpose to do that in order for your marriage to be healthy.
Yeah, obviously I totally agree with Mary. And the three that I would add, and we're going to do a series in the fall on relationships, and one of the weeks is marriage. And so this past week, because I wasn't teaching today, I was working on that message. And so the 3 points, I'm going to spoil it, okay? So you're all going to know my 3 points for a message I'm doing in August or September. It doesn't matter. September, yeah. Is I think the three things that every marriage needs is quality time, communication, and sex. And how many of you are excited about this series? But I think because those all go hand in hand. So you have quality time that will, if you don't have quality time, you're not going to have good communication. If you don't have good communication and quality time, you're not going to be very intimate in your marriage. And sex is the greatest gift that God has given marriages. And some people are feel uncomfortable to talk about it. I'm not uncomfortable, because God gave us sex as a gift. And so I want to see couples spending quality time together and connecting and having that problem solving through good communication. And then, allowing that to impact their intimacy, because when all three of those are in good rhythm and healthy in a marriage, it's a strong marriage. And so often busyness, as Mary is talking about, will cut down on quality time. If you don't have quality time, now you're not really communicating well. When you are communicating, it's typically because you're ticked off at each other. And then obviously that's not a good foundation that then you want to go and connect with your spouse, physically. So.
Yeah, you've mentioned communication several times. I know for my marriage particularly, the communication has been so key in all seasons of life. And so could you kind of give us some just ideas of how to communicate better in our marriages?
Yeah, I would say quality time has to be the priority. So as I just said, because here's the truth of every single marriage is you need to learn to talk, because there's always going to be new problems. So like every season, so when Mary and I were newlyweds, that has its own unique season of problems. Now we're living together for the first time. Mary inherited a very messy person. She's a very neat person, and so we figure out that rhythm. I had no context for asking permission to go out. I thought, I'm an adult. And I still remember early on in our marriage where she's like, I went out with my friends, and she's like, you didn't even ask. And I was like, this is the dumbest thing to ever say. Okay, so just everyone prep yourself. But I was like, what, are you my mom? And do you remember that? I don't even remember that. Scarred her. And yeah, so when I woke up from being knocked out, then it was just one of those things that that was my context, and so we had to communicate. So anyway, so then we moved to a new city, and that's a new season, new problems. We have a kid that's each season, so you have to learn to communicate. But if you're not spending that quality time together, then all you're ever going to do is address negatives. And so you have to make it a priority. We're going to hang out, we're going to have fun together, we're going to talk normally about normal life things, so that we have a little bit of foundation, so when we need to address difficult things, we can do that, and it's not all that we're talking about. And then I would say one last thing, and then Mary can jump in, is I think you need to have rules in communication, specifically with fighting. And we'll talk maybe a little bit more about this. I know in some of the other services today, we're going to go a little bit more in depth on this. But I think when you fight, you have to have rules that govern that. So whether it be, we're not going to yell, we're not going to bring up past things, we're not going to switch topics. And I know that maybe sounds odd, but I actually encourage couples to write down, what are your rules of fighting? And then you're both submitting to it and saying, okay, here's our rules. And so in our relationship, our rules are we don't fight in front of our kids is one part of it, but we're not going to yell. Now, I'm more emotional about this than she is, and so Mary, I've shared this before, is I've learned that I yell with a tone more than a volume, even though I can get animated. And so the rules are I have to keep my tone, low, and some other things that we can talk about later. But I think you set some rules and say, if we're going to address these things, we need to have some rules that we submit to.
Because it's not fair to want your spouse to communicate with you, but then to go against those rules when you are having disagreements. So if you pout and you leave the room and you just won't discuss anything, that's not fair. If you yell at the person, that's not fair. So you have to have those certain boundaries. But I think, again, I'll just emphasize what you said at the beginning, is being so purposed about making time to communicate. And I think we have to be purposed people in our lives. We make time for what we want to do. And for some of us, I think we don't put the value in what communication and spending time with our spouse will do for our marriage. So we just have to be so purposed to block out, if you have to, say from this time to this time is when we're going to communicate every night. If that's sitting at the dinner table, if it's before you go to bed, sitting on the bed talking. But we have to be purposed in order for our marriages to be healthy.
Yeah, marriages are more important than kids, because the best thing you can do for your kids is have a healthy marriage. But marriage is more important than sleep. And I know I love sleep. So, but I mean, like, it's the number one priority below your relationship with God. And it has to, the proof of that is in the choices that you make. So if you go, yeah, marriage is a priority, but then sleep trumps it, your kids trump it, your job trumps it, your hobbies trump it, it's not a priority, and it will show, and it will be unhealthy.
Great stuff. Let's transition a little bit. I know this is a question that we commonly get because a lot of LCCers are just curious about it. But in terms of when the Bible talks about being unequally yoked, and it talks about, you're not supposed to unequally yoke yourself with an unbeliever, what are kind of the challenges with that, and what does a spouse do in that situation? If they feel the call of God, they're coming into an amazing church and God is moving them and changing their lives, and they're wanting to take steps towards tithing or whatever it is that God's calling them to, but maybe their spouse isn't on that same level or even isn't close. So how does somebody deal with that situation?
Okay, yeah, let's define that term, because it's a scriptural term, but it's a church term. Unequally yoked is found in 2 Corinthians 6, where Paul is encouraging people not to be unequally yoked. And yoked was a term so they would take two animals and they would harness them, yoke them, and they would plow. And his encouragement was the same way that you wouldn't take one animal or two different types of animals or one larger animal and try to yoke them together and then plow, because one of them would be stronger, it would grow crooked, you could not plow straight. So the imagery that Paul is using is that if you connect relationally with someone that's not going the same direction as you, one of you are going to pull the other. And typically, it's just, for whatever reason it is, probably our sin nature, it's the person who least wants to go toward Christ that's going to pull you away. So Paul uses that phraseology in a relational terms, not necessarily specifically marriage, but it is applied to marriage. Paul is saying, even in our close relationships and friendships, don't be yoked with unbelievers. And that's the phraseology that he uses. Because he says there's no relationship between godly people and Belial or sin or demonic activity. He was just saying, like, you want to make sure you're connected to relationally to someone that's going in the same direction as you, because it's powerful. So in the church world, that often happens where one spouse is ahead of the other in a depth of maturity. And so it creates a tension because they're not going in the same direction. And what's unfair is, not unfair, but you understand this when I say it, is oftentimes people get married and they're in the same place, then one gets saved and one changes, and so now the other spouse feels like, oh, that's unfair. Like, I married this person who was fun, now you're a Christian, and they think, like, you're not fun anymore, and so there is that tension. So what I would say is, I would encourage the person who gets saved is to realize this truth, and this is for all of us, is on one level, we all have a general calling. It's the calling to die to ourselves. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, the call of Christ is that he bids me come and die. It's this idea. So when we get saved, we're dying to ourselves. That's the general calling of all Christians. But then we all have specific, unique callings where God has placed us. So he places us in our relationships, he places us in our jobs, places us in our church, places us in our community. So if you are now in a relationship with a marriage where your spouse is not in the same place, that's your calling. So you want to live in such a way that your lifestyle becomes a draw. So I'll tell you, as a male perspective, and Mary can speak for a female, if Mary were to just nag me toward spiritual maturity, that is the worst strategy ever. The more she nags me, the more I want to run the other way. if Mary so models for me that there's value in serving Christ, it becomes attractive to me. So if she is really attentive to my needs, she really loves me, she's generous, she's still fun, and she still connects, that becomes attractive to me. So, and I can tell you stories, and they would not at all be embarrassed by me saying this, but like one of our pastors, Phil Vinrick, he was further along in his path than Stacy was at the time. But so he just loved her, and Stacy just started to connect, and then she started to connect with the other Christians and found like they're fun too, and they're connected. And now Stacy, I mean, she's obviously radically on fire for God, and she's one of the greatest parts of our church. But Phil did that by modeling for her that what real life looks like, and it's exciting. So I would say if you're that spouse, live in such a way that you're so attractive, and the light that you're shining is so attractive that your spouse wants to come that direction. Don't guilt them, don't nag them, don't expect them to be at your maturity, because they simply won't be. They don't have the same values at that point. Specifically, you want to jump in? Or
Well, I was just saying, yeah, I think high pressure does not work well from the spouse, and the nagging, that's not, it's not going to be beneficial to the spouse who maybe is unsaved or who doesn't have a deeper relationship with Christ. But I would also just encourage to continue to pray for your spouse. Absolutely. And recognize what Matt was saying, that this is your calling in life, to be the example for your spouse, to love them. And that's, again, easy to say, difficult to do, because you have that burning desire for them to know God and to live a life that you know will be beneficial for them. But it is probably the best route that you can take is to be that example and show them the love.
Mm-hmm. And I'd be careful with prioritizing all activities of the church over your marriage. There are some that you still should prioritize church, and there will be some unavoidable tensions in a marriage, because you're called to this, and you know God's called you, and you need to do that. But if you're going to every church activity and now your husband's like, man, I can't get any quality time with you, they're going to have such a resentment toward the church, and they'll never be able to overcome that. Specifically, you just kind of referenced, there's a lot of tension and questions that we get is, okay, I want to tithe, my husband or wife doesn't. I would say you have to navigate that through a relational conversation. But if you make money, I would say tithe on your money. If it's your money together, you really do need still your spouse's permission to do that. I think God will know your heart, and he'll honor that. So as you're able to always be faithful and generous with your money. But if it's like, if you're the stay-at-home spouse, and so it's not really, you understand these terms as I'm saying, if not your money or whatever, it's your guys' money together, I don't think it's a wise thing to go and tithe, because again, if a spouse has no context of church, they're going to think all that church wants is your money, and they're going to be really bitter toward that. And I don't think there's a lot of wisdom in that. But I've known a lot of couples that have just worked out relationally with their spouse, where they've said, hey, I work and I make this money, I'm going to tithe on my money. And their spouse is like, okay, if you want to do that, that's fine. And they've been able to navigate that. But you need to have a relational conversation. I don't think, and I talk about money a lot, and I'm very passionate about it because I think it's so important. But I don't think that's the hill to die on with your spouse. I think you want their heart before you get the financial side of that. So I think you got to navigate that slowly.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's communicate or transition back into kind of the Christian community. And I know that there's often a lot of talk, just even in culture, as we watch the news and all these things about sex in general, just in how we're in such opposition of sex before marriage and those things. But what about sex within marriage? How does that typically look different? And if somebody is kind of asking questions about what that looks like, what would you encourage them to kind of think about?
Let me take this one too.
Sure. Yeah,
And so here's the thing that we get a lot is the church has this reputation of being anti-sex, but here's the truth: God is more pro-sex than anyone who has ever lived, and people hear that and they're like, "Did you just say God pro-sex?" Absolutely, God. And I've taught on this numerous times. So let me tell you a real quick story. So 4 years ago, I did the series on sex and marriage, and I talked for 3 weeks on that, and it was by far the most watched sermon that I've ever done, and so which is fun to see that. But in that message, at the end of one of the services, I challenged all the married couples in our church to have sex for 14 straight days, and it was funny, and because at the end of every message, I give a challenge, and I said, I want you to do this, and people were like so shocked by that. It was pretty funny, but I got so many high five from all the guys as they were walking out. They're like, best sermon ever, Matt. And a friend of mine said that they were walking out, and there was 2 couples that were guests of our church, and they were walking out in front of them, and the guys were walking behind, and they said, man, we love this church. But here's the thing: God is pro-sex. He created sex. Adam and Eve didn't discover it, and God came around the corner and was like, "What are you doing?" God created it, commanded it, gave us desire for it. God commanded. So, like He said to Adam and Eve, it's one of the first proactive commands. So, one restrictive command was don't eat of the tree, but His proactive command was be fruitful and multiply. God's telling them to have sex, but He designed it for the context of marriage. So, sex is designed to be the most powerful and intimate tool that couples could use to connect. It's for this reason. So in Genesis 2, it says, for this reason, a man and woman will leave father and mother and unite to each other, and it's the language of sex. They will have sex, they will hold fast to each other, have sex, and the two will become one flesh. So God gave it for joy, God gave it for pleasure, God gave it for creating, but He gave it as a way for two to unite. Our culture is so perverted and destroyed and made it something different, that sex has now been reduced to simply a physical activity. And so many singles especially are engaging in sexual activity because it's simply a physical thing to them, and it's been reduced down to that to them. The problem with that is then later on when they want to get married, it no longer has that same powerful element because it becomes baggage that they carry into marriage. So when we're teaching and saying that God restricts sex for just marriage, it's not because God is trying to withhold fun, it's because God knows the power of sex. It is the only way mentioned in Scripture where two become one. And so as a church, we talk about sex, and I talk about at least once a year typically. When I teach in the youth ministry, I teach on it. I've been invited into schools to talk on it. I always try to paint it in the most positive of lights in the context of marriage. So it is a wonderful gift, but it is one that is best used in marriage, and anything outside of sex between a husband and a wife in the context of marriage, anything outside of that is sexual immorality, which is sin, but it's also super destructive. And one last thing, Paul says it this way, and I think it's the most powerful way to word it. Paul says, everyone sins. He says, but every other sin is outside your body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. What Paul's acknowledging is there's something more than physical about sex. It's emotional, it's relational, it's spiritual. To illustrate this, you have to go to a negative, but it's the reason why sex crimes are worse than just regular crimes, because we understand it's connecting with something deeper than just a physical part of a person's body. And so, again, God is pro-sex, but He's pro-sex in the context of marriage because of the power of it.
Yeah. In terms of just marriages in general, what are some things that you can do as a couple to kind of help with devotions? I know that this is a common question, and my wife and I struggle with this because she feels like I'm always pastoring her. Like that I go and I have all the answers and the church answers, So as far as devotions go, how is it best to kind of do that with each other?
Let me acknowledge something that Mary can answer this. Mary and I don't do devotions together, so I know that will shock a lot of people. Mary has, I would say, the unfortunate reality of her life is I'm her pastor too. So she sits down and hears me preach, and she's very complimentary, says that she loves to hear me preach. We'll even say that I'm her favorite preacher, and right? And except there are times that she'll go, man, I just heard this incredible message by Andy Stanley or Jimmy Evans. I should have to tell me about it, and I'll be like, well, I preached on the same topic 2 weeks ago, and so no, I'm just joking with that, but. So we don't do devotions together because it just wouldn't fit our rhythm. Because I would be that mode too, where I'm like, okay, let's break down Romans, and go through that. And so, but what we do have is we have our personal devotional time, and then we have spiritual conversations often, almost daily. So we're talking about spiritual things. So I don't think that there's like you have to do this in order to be a married couple. It has to look this way. But I would say you want to make sure you're having spiritual conversations, and each of you individually are pursuing God. Now, all that said, there are some helpful things that you can do to have a healthy devotion life if you want to do that.
Yeah, there's lots of tools out there. There's lots of Bible studies that you can do together. And I know some couples love that, and they enjoy doing that. They enjoy getting each other's perspective on things. It's something that they spend their quality time together discussing, and that is wonderful. But I don't think it's set in stone that each couple has to do it a certain format, a certain way. We like to do, like Matt was saying, we like to have a lot of spiritual discussions. We talk about messages we've heard. We talk about things he's studying, I'm studying, bounce things off each other. But we don't necessarily have a set point each day that we sit down and do a devotion together.
And Mary will listen to a good sermon. She'll say, hey, you have to listen to this sermon. And I'll listen to it, and I'll say, hey, I was just listening to this pastor. You got to check this message out. And so it keeps that connection. It's just for our rhythm, that wouldn't work. So.
how does that look in a dating relationship or somebody who's engaged? Does it look any different, or just because of the intimacy of devotion sometimes, how does that look in a dating relationship?
Yeah, I've heard multiple perspectives on this. I would say the bare minimum you want to do in a dating relationship is have very purpose spiritual conversations. So I think you have to acknowledge what your goal is, because it creates some accountability in that relationship. So right when you start off dating, defining and I would say you should only be dating a Christian. That's what unequally yoked is really talking about, is connecting relationally before marriage. But you should have spiritual conversations where you're saying, this is my goal. I'm going here, and that person goes, absolutely. So now you've defined our goal is to become like Christ. Our goal is to be sexually pure in this relationship. Our goal is to become more like Christ, and then have spiritual conversations. So whether that be like what we're talking about, where each of you individually are doing your own devotions, and then you're talking about that, whether you want to read a book together, and then have a conversation about it, I think that's great. Praying for each other is good. I've heard some people talk about there's such a powerful intimacy with that you have to be careful. I don't know. I don't have any context about that. Maybe that would be difficult. I don't know. So the answer to that part of your question is, but I would just say you want to have spiritual conversations, and that way you've defined this is our goal. So when Mary and I, when we were dating, we clearly communicated that our goal was to be virgins when we got married, and we were. So both of us we had never had sex outside of marriage, whether with anyone else or each other, and that was a goal. Very difficult to honor that, especially when you're dating 8 years, 4 of those high school, 4 of those college, especially when you get engaged, because now you really feel committed. So it's difficult. It wasn't always easy, but it was one that we honored, but it's because we defined this is what we want. So.
I want to talk about this because it is such an important topic within our church specifically. This year we've started the addiction support group and a number of different opportunities for people to get help in those situations. So how can you handle if your spouse is somebody who is addicted to something, whether it's pornography or whether it's a substance or something like that? How do you encourage, I guess, couples to manage that together?
You want to take that, or you want me?
You go ahead.
I think just first committing in your mind that you're there for them matters, because it's so emotionally draining when your spouse is engaging in addicted, destructive behavior. So you have to just commit, like, this is my ministry. I'm here to serve them. Our culture will so quickly now tell people, you got to protect yourself and get out. So I would say you're committed to them. But what that looks like is different in each situation. So if your spouse is addicted to alcohol or drugs or some type of substance, I think you have to, in love, confront that. I think you need to get professional help and spiritual help. So I would say, if it's in our church, meet with one of our pastors. Let's figure out a game plan of how we can address that. Most people, when they're initially addicted, they're not going to admit it. I mean, this is just some of the common sense stuff that we know in our culture. They won't admit it, so the first part of recovery is admitting that you're an addict. But you need to have a conversation where you're confronting that, so that you're exposing how it's impacting you, and you begin that conversation. And then you get that professional help, you get that spiritual help and that accountability, and you start working toward a goal. Now, there are some elements in that you will have to protect yourself in the process of while someone's in addiction, because they're not thinking clearly, they're not acting clearly. So if someone has sexual addiction, that's more than just pornography addiction. So pornography addiction is destructive. Sexual addiction, by definition, that term is people who start to engage in very risky sexual activity, and it includes adultery, and this is where people start to meet strangers and have sex and things like that. So you got to protect yourself physically, and some of that might be drug tests or blood tests, and making sure that they don't have diseases. It might be a time of separation with that, but it's all of the time of separation has to be separation with a goal. Separation with the goal of getting back together. And so working through that with the professional help is key, and creating a game plan. So we oftentimes, because you're one of our pastors, we'll sit down with couples and we'll say, okay, here's where we are. We're in crisis, whether it be marriage crisis, addiction crisis, whatever. Let's figure out a game plan. So sometimes they're going to meet with us periodically, but on top of that, they're getting professional counseling. Sometimes they're going to rehab, and we don't have a cookie cutter approach to couples. We have let's sit down and let's talk it through. So what works, and I'm doing this now with 3 or 4 couples, and I don't do all of it, though I'm passionate about marriage. These are couples that are part of my group, but I know you and the other pastors sit down with them and say, let's figure this out. So I think get professional help, and then create a system to get out. Does that sound good?
Yeah. I know that everybody's you start that initial process of dating together, and so you have that fun season, once you get married, you have that honeymoon season of life. But how do you maintain that kind of dating, especially for you guys specifically? Can you give some ideas as far as what you guys do as far as dating one another?
Right. Again, keyword, you have to be purposed. So especially in our busy life, and we have 4 kids, so we know what that's about. We really have to be purposed to set specific time aside in order for us to date. And I think, if I'm honest, earlier in our marriage, when we first started having kids, this was more of a battle for me because I felt like, well, I don't know that we have the money to do this, to have a babysitter or to spend money to go out. But I soon realized how important it was for the 2 of us to have that separation time, be separated from our kids, and experience some of the things that we did before we were married. So we are very purposed. We're passionate about having date nights. And at different seasons, that has looked differently for us because we have had infants that we couldn't really leave them for very long. And some things that we've done, and I know Matt has talked about this in the past, is we've put the kids to bed early, and then one of us has gone out and gotten takeout, and we'll bring it back home, and that serves as our date for that night. We'll sit down, watch a movie together while we've already have the kids put to bed, and that's had to be our fill-in for a date night for years. That was because we couldn't be gone for very long. We've also now had...
And those days would look like one of us would call each other or text each other and say, hey, you want to go on a date tonight? And yeah, absolutely. And we knew what that meant. That meant one of us is going to get takeout. So it's not, for some, that doesn't seem super romantic, but it was powerful for us in that season because I'm wired in a way, if I don't have that relational connection, I start to withdraw. So it's counterintuitive. The more I want to connect, if we don't connect, the more withdrawal I am. And same thing for her. She's with kids all day, and she needed to have adult language, adult communication, and not adult language. Mary just needs to cuss periodically, man. She just needs to get it out.
All right, we put the kids to bed now.
Yeah. Now we're gonna dress up the beep beep. I'm like, oh god, earmuffs, and so. All right, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's all right. But then we also had to be very. We had to set aside money in our budget for date nights. So when the kids were older and we didn't have as much family in town, we would have a babysitter, and we would have to be purposed about, saying this money is going to be for a couple of weeks, we're going to be able to go out on a date. And we're blessed to have more family in town now that is very generous with their time and watches the kids for us, so we can do those things. But I would also say, don't let budget be a big hindrance to you, because you can do things that are fun that don't cost very much money. Just this weekend, Matt's mom and her husband Skip watched the kids for us on Friday night. And we went to Columbus, and we didn't spend a whole lot of money. We went to a free art show that was outside and walked around, and that was a lot of fun for us, something different that we hadn't done in a long time.
Most amazing people watching in the world.
But that didn't have to cost a lot of money in order for us to do that. So I would encourage you in that way, be creative in your thinking, and don't be bogged down by saying, well, we don't have enough money to do this. Find creative solutions. We've also tag teamed with other families and couples that we're good friends with to watch each other's kids, to offer a night out for them, and they've done the same for us. We can babysit each other's kids so we can get out.
Going back to the people watching, it was funny. We're walking. They have booths on both sides, and there were times I realized I'm walking by booths. I'm not even looking in the booth. I'm just watching people. I'm like, so looking back and forth. Anyone else people watchers? No. Like airports and art fairs, I've learned are the best. So, random topic.
Awesome tips, though.
Yeah.
On many levels.
Here, one other quick thing. So now in our marriage, so we prioritize date nights as the big times we go out. But we also, every single night, so this is a priority in our marriage, is every single night at 9 o'clock, roughly, at 9 o'clock, we come together and we connect. So, because it used to be, we would get frustrated, Mary, with our kids. We'd put the kids down, and Mary, who's very task-oriented, would think, this is the best time now for me to get done all my other work. So she would get busy around the house. I would be frustrated that she's not connecting with me. In hindsight, I should have asked her for help, or asked to help her. But I would get frustrated that she's not connecting. So I would go and start working on church stuff. I'd go sit in my room and get my laptop out and start working. So she's downstairs ticked that I'm not helping her. I'm upstairs ticked that she's not connecting to me. And so we realized that we had to figure out a rhythm to that. So now we work together to get our kids down and help with the house stuff and that kind of deal. And then at 9 o'clock we come together and we watch one show a night. And we'll pause that show in the middle of it, and we'll have conversations, and we'll talk. But we just know we need to connect relationally every single day. So there is not a day that goes by, unless it's a very, very rare thing, there's not a day go by that we don't spend at least an hour together in quality time. So again, these things that we're saying is not hypothetical. This is like written in law to us, because it's what allows us to maintain that romance and that dating and that health and that connection.
Real quickly, how do you communicate that to your children? Because I know a lot of children will be like, I want to stay up. I have all these things I want to do. I don't want to go to bed. Those types of things. We fight that. So how do you communicate to your children that it's a priority and that it's important?
We just straight up tell them.
We do. I was going to say, that's going to be my answer too.
You're going to bed now because we've spent all day with you doing fun things with you, but now it's your time to go to bed. And sometimes that looks different. I mean, sometimes they go and they read, and we're still up watching something together, or they're in their rooms. But and we realized this didn't always happen when I had babies, and we were trying, I was trying to be up in the night with babies. Things had to look a little different. So seasons of life do look different, but we still had to be purposed in order to spend time together.
Yeah, we've been clear with our kids. It's not a democracy. It's a dictatorship. It's a benevolent dictatorship, but it's a dictatorship. And so we do tell them this is mom and dad's time, because we want them to understand that. And I've said to my kids, I love you guys, but you came into the world. Mommy and I were already here. You came into the world, and you're going to not go out of the world, but you're going to leave our home, at some point. So we're still going to be together, and she's my priority. So even in our parenting, I've told my kids, you're not going to disrespect my wife. I've used that language at times. You're not going to disrespect your mom, but it's also my wife. But we want our kids to understand. That's why we go on date nights. And date night is on our Friday family time too. So every Friday we either have pizza night and we watch a movie, or we go on a date and we get a babysitter. So they know this is still important, that mom and I go out, and it's important to us in our marriage.
Now, I know you want to spend some time praying over these things,
Yeah.
so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, so again, I would encourage you to watch the other services later on, because you get different questions. Here's my heart to you. So I want to say two things. One is don't allow your marriage to deteriorate by yourself. Get help. We meet often, and the more we talk about it, the more we receive requests, and it's difficult. We are not perfect as a church, but we're striving to be. So we're really working hard behind the scenes. I just had a meeting this week with Skip and Ron about this, where we're just talking about marriage and what this ministry is going to look like in our church in the future. And so we're going to walk through it with you together and figure it out. And we really do hope in the upcoming years it becomes a very dynamic element of our church. And our goal in our meetings behind the scenes is we want to create a system that helps people, no matter where they are in marriage, from absolute crisis to healthy, and I just want to maintain that. We want to have something for everyone. So if you need help, come and allow us to partner with you. We are not going to judge you. It doesn't make us think less of you. It won't impact our relationship. We want your marriage to be the best possible. And so allow us that privilege, if you would. And then right now, I just know that marriages can be tough, so I want to take a moment and just pray over you, whether you're married or you're single and one day you want to be married. I just want to pray over both of you. Well, God, first of all, we thank you that you are a God who gave us marriage, and you're a God who sustains marriages. And I know that for many, marriage can be both a blessing, but it can be a curse in some ways. It can be very difficult, and marriage exposes the selfishness of our own heart. It exposes the ugliness of our lives, but it also can bring such powerful redemption. And when we are loved and when we're able to show love, it's a very powerful cycle. And so I pray right now over every marriage here that your Holy Spirit will supernaturally touch it and strengthen it. I pray for the wounds that have been committed, that you will heal them, that you will soften each other's hearts, the spouses that are represented here. I pray that you will give them wisdom on what to say and how to act. I pray that you give them strength, especially those that are in a marriage where they don't have the same vision and the same passion for you. Allow them to have your strength so that they can be a shining light. And Lord, I pray for all the singles that are here that desire to be married at some point, that you will help them to stay pure, that you will help them to learn now to die to themselves so that it's a natural progression as they enter into marriage. And I pray you bring into their lives the obvious choice that you have for them, a person who is as passionate about Jesus as they are. And God, I pray that you protect them until they find that person. We love you, Lord, and pray all this in your mighty name.